And this is the fifth lecture for the week. And this would be the lecture that will wrap up the first week of our semester together. And we are still exploring the question of the, um, the black vernacular. And I've introduced the idea of the slave narrative. One of the critical reasons for doing so is because the next work that we'll be looking at will be the autobiography of an ex-colored man, written by James Weldon Johnson. And in an interesting kind of way, the very constructions and aesthetics of that work and the context of that work resonates and connects very strongly with these slave narratives. We've talked about Alauda Equiano, we've talked about Frederick Douglass, and now we'll talk about Harriet Jacob. In this course, she'll be one of the women, one of the single woman with a slave narrative. Of course, she wasn't the only woman with a slave narrative. There were several others who produced slave narratives. And it's interesting in the case of Harriet Jacobs, um, who used the name Linda Brent in the work. Her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is also represents a self-authored work. But it's worth noting that initially Harriet Jacob was reluctant to write it because she just didn't think she had the capacity to do so, to write a whole book. And she while she was encouraged to write her biography, autobiography, um, those who were encouraging her and who were planning to help her to get it published agreed with her that it might be interesting um, to get somebody else to write it. And at the time, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin, her novel had just come out and was extremely successful. She was presumed to be sympathetic to anti-slavery movements, um, and so Harriet Jacobs and her companion and people who were supporting her agreed that it might be interesting to ask Harriet Beecher Stowe um, to to write this book, this biography. And what Jacobs did was she did a detailed outline. She wrote a detailed outline and an introductory statement and so on. And then the intention was to get that to Harriet Beecher Stowe, who would then, was the plan that she would then allow Harriet Douglass to tell her story to her. And of course, she would write it because she was the great writer. Beecher Stowe's initial response was negative because she was traveling. She said she was going to be traveling to England to promote her book. This is in the 1850s. Um, Harriet Jacob and her interloper, the person who was talking to, um, writing to back and forth. They were writing back and forth to Harriet Beecher Stowe. They proposed the plan um, that Harriet Douglass's daughter, Louisa, who lived with her, could travel to England with Harriet Beecher Stowe. And while they are traveling, she would tell her mother's story, and she would have all the details to be able to tell her mother's story. Harriet Beecher Stowe declined. She demurred, and she said she felt that if Louisa was traveling with her to England, she may be spoiled, was her word, by all the attention she would receive and all the sympathy she would receive. Harriet Jacobs was not happy. She was embarrassed, and she was particularly embarrassed because of the her suspicion that the reason that Harriet Beecher Stowe had declined to write the book had both to do with race, but also had to do with Harriet Jacob, the fact that Harriet Jacob was a woman who had two children out of wedlock, And the detail of the stories was that she had chosen to have these children out of wedlock. And she herself felt great shame for it. And in fact, it was one of the reasons why she wasn't even going to write this autobiography. So it's at that point that Harriet Beecher Stowe declined and was out of the picture, and Harriet Jacob eventually came to the view that she should write the piece herself, and which she eventually did. But let's talk a little bit about Harriet Jacob. Um, she was born in into slavery in North Carolina. She was born in either the year 1815 or 1817. It's hard; they're not sure which of those dates. And she would live a fairly robust life until 97. So um, she until 1897. So she would have died in her late 70s, early 80s. So she lived quite a full life. Um, she was the child of an enslaved woman and a white father. And her siblings were also a product of that situation, not unlike Frederick Douglass, and not unlike quite a few African Americans who gained prominence. Booker T. Washington was also a child of an enslaved woman and a white father. This pattern existed. As I said in an earlier lecture on slavery, it's worth returning to the interesting question because, in truth, Harriet Jacobs' mother was mixed race, and her father was white, which would have made Harriet Jacob a fairly white person by most standards. And the reason why Harriet Jacob remained a slave, even though her father was not a slave, was because of that legal system called patus sequitur ventrem, which literally means that which is born follows the womb. That had been made into law in 1862 in Virginia. And of course, after 1862 in Virginia, it would be taken up as a legal, as the law of the land throughout the entire colonial America, and it would continue right through slavery. It was also became the law of the land for British slavery and for the Spanish and the French slavery. And what did that mean? It meant that if a woman, any child born of a woman, if the woman he took on, or he or she took on the status of their mother. The reason why it was enshrined in law in 1862 was that prior to that, as I had said before, indentureship, there were many people who sued the government for their own freedom, either because their father was white and because there was some confusion or some mix-up in terms of the paternity and the structure of the paternity. And so Virginia, obviously recognizing that the only way to create a system by which they could perpetuate slavery through reproduction and through the business of reproduction would be to come up with this law to patus sequitur ventrum, which said that any child born of a enslaved woman was a slave. Interestingly, if the child was born of a free woman, a white woman, the child would be free. But of course, that happened far less, and therefore, so many of the African Americans were enslaved as a result of that, and that was the situation with Harriet Jacob. So Harriet Jacob, of course, grew up, and she faced many prospects of being sold. and therefore had a sense of being in a very vulnerable situation because, of course, she could be sold at any point, and she was sold at many points and so on. And as she became of age, one of the things that began to happen was that her owner began to press her to have sex with her. He wanted to sleep with her. He began to harass her, and she would escape it. Her grandmother lived on the same plantation, and so she would try to get to her grandmother and was protected for a while, but eventually his harassment became truly significant. So part of the story that you'll read about is Harriet Jacob famously eventually escaping slavery, not by fleeing or going anywhere, but by hiding in a garret under the house of her grandmother, and living there for many years, not coming out or coming out very rarely. She could see her children running up and down to avoid this man. And there, the story of Harriet Jacob is finding ways to avoid rape, to avoid sexual exploitation, to avoid the control of her body by other people. And one of the telling things that happened with Harriet Jacob is that she, in order to protect herself, she eventually decided to make an alliance by allowing a kinder gentleman, a kinder white man, to sleep with her. And she calculated that if she became the concubine of that man, then her owner would not put pressure on her and would be discouraged from making advances on her. This turned out to be true. She had two children by this man, but eventually, even having had these children by this man, Sawyer, who would go on to be either a governor of the state or a high legislator, her owner kept persisting, and this is why she ended up hiding. Eventually, Harriet Jacob found an opportunity to escape, literally this time escape, and she escaped to Philadelphia, and spent time moving across the North because, of course, since she was still an enslaved person and slavery still existed, and in 1852 America had passed the Fugitive Slave Law, it meant that the people who owned her could send bounty hunters and other people, and they themselves would go up there to look for her if they could find her and bring her back into slavery. So for much of her life, until the abolition of slavery, Harriet Jacobs was in flight until her freedom was eventually bought in about 1863 for about $300 by a very kind person. Harriet Jacobs' story would eventually be published, and it would be a story that would tell the horrible details of being enslaved, the challenges of sexual exploitation, the challenges of labor, the challenges of the auction block, and it became a very important document for the abolition movement, and a document that would be passed around. It was actually quite successful. It sold. It was published in the UK as well. Harriet Jacob herself got to the UK, and she became part of this abolitionist effort. And as I said, one of the reasons why she was reluctant to publish this book was because she felt that there would be such a negative response to the fact that in those days, her own morality would be in question. And what she was trying to demonstrate was that slavery as a system put the kinds of pressures on women and men that they did not have the freedom and the liberty to uphold the very chastity and the morality that they themselves even desired to hold to, because of course they were property and they could be used in the ways that they could be. So Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is a fascinating work because it's a work that takes us through the full journey of Harriet Jacobs. And it is a telling journey that leads us to an understanding of slavery, the nature of slavery, and the impact of slavery. So when we come back for the second part of this two-part talk, I will talk a little bit about the content of that work, particularly paying attention to the audience for that work and how Harriet Jacobs navigated the question of audience and established the audience by the ways in which she wrote the book. And then we can talk a little bit also about the calculated and careful way in which she wrote that work to manage and protect the people who were still in danger and were still vulnerable while she was writing it. In other words, Harriet Jacobs was writing this book as a fugitive, right? As a woman who was also in danger, and who was living in a country in which you never knew whether, in fact, how the war was going to go. You never knew. At the time, the book came out during the war, and at that time, nobody knew how the war was going to go. And the war could have ended in favor of the Confederacy, and the Confederacy would then have returned everybody to slavery, and so on and so forth. So it was a very difficult time, but more yet.